This talk title I basically put up kind of as a joke, because nobody really thinks about what they do as ontology except for maybe a few librarians and knowledge managers. But I guarantee that if we sit down, every single organization in this room will have a different idea of what we mean when we say the word identity. And most of the time, they will use exactly the same words to describe the concepts which are used in different ways inside of their organization. So they'll use words like trust. Oh, we think identity is about trust. And everybody agree, yes, identity is about trust. But what's inside of their head will be a completely different thing. Because when you say trust in medicine, and when you say trust in aerospace, and when you say trust in finance, they mean three different things, right? Trust in medicine, will the patient die or not? Have we done everything we know how to do? Trust in aerospace, you need a chain of custody for the stuff. Trust in finance, is this guy going to steal my house? Totally different models. So what I'm going to present is what I think is a simple way of getting organizations to be able to make their trust models interoperate. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to bang everything flat and turn it all into money. Because all of the organizations know how to interoperate in a straight financial sense. And if we try and synchronize all of our ontologies and all the rest of that stuff, it's going to take about 300 years before we get a thing that works. So we're just going to bash it all flat until it looks like money. And at that point, we should be able to build an identity system that actually works in the Netherlands in about a year. How does that sound for an ambitious goal? Right? I think you could build a working system in less time than it will take to get prototypes done. So how do we clarify the identity with better databases? We all know the blockchain is basically a database. Most of what I'm going to say could be done on any kind of better database. Blockchains, meshes, weaves, scaled blockchains, permissioned ledgers. Doesn't really matter because what I'm going to talk about is fundamental understandings of how the world works and some ideas about how to build financial instruments that solve problems that we currently have. So this is really a talk about a new financial instrument. What you use to implement that financial instrument doesn't really matter. You could even have different institutions using their own representations of these financial instruments and interoperating. So the idea is to bash everything down to the lowest common denominator, which is cash, and then you can carry that using whatever underlying technology you have. So, about me, hands up anybody that has no idea who I am or why I'm here? Okay, that's shocking. So in the 1990s, I was one of the cypherpunks. I was very interested in cryptography and human rights. By 2006, I was working for the Department of Defense on a very similar project. The idea was to produce an identity card standard that could be used in Iraq and Afghanistan without differentially empowering bad actors. I led the sort of processes for the Ethereum launch. So I basically held that part of the show together. And basically, there aren't very many experts in this stuff. This is a frontier. Nobody has deep expertise on a frontier. You just have a bunch of people with capability wandering around doing things. And I'm certainly one of those. So I was asked to do a very quick run through on what a blockchain is. I'm going to make this very brief. So you begin, right? The only reason anybody's heard of the blockchain is because you can make your own money on a blockchain. So you have some bunch of lunatics that figure out how to print 60, 80, 120 billion dollars of anonymous digital cash. Everybody stares at this in wonder and then says, okay, whatever they did, I want some of that. Underlying technology from Bitcoin is called the blockchain. Ethereum, the project that I was part of, then adds a whole bunch of programmability back into that system. And as I mentioned, this stuff is ridiculously valuable right now. So the blockchain itself is basically three components that are fairly common taken to another level. So there's a peer-to-peer network, and the world is filled with peer-to-peer networking software. Skype, BitTorrent, Tor, all of this stuff. The underlying network technology in blockchain is not that new. Shared database, something like Google or Dropbox, so there are a bunch of synchronization algorithms that keep everything well behaved. So one person looks at the world, somebody else looks at the world, they see the same thing. And then finally, there are some rules for updating the shared database, and this is where all the magic is packed. You could think of the entire thing as being a new software architecture, so it's in a class with things like any of the big enterprise software abstractions, model view controller or cloud, all of that stuff are in the same basic architectural bucket. usually the blockchain is seen as a platform, even though it's actually an architecture. So a running blockchain could be called a platform. The underlying thing is actually an architecture. So the funny business is that normally when we've got a sort of shared database, we don't have sophisticated ways of figuring out how the rules will be updated. So most of the thing that we've seen so far from peer-to-peer networks, the unit of selection is a file. And you move a file up to the Dropbox or you take a file out of the Dropbox. But there are no real instances of these things that have complicated rules for modifying the contents of a shared file. That's an operation that we don't do very much. And that's where blockchain actually gets its power from. We set a set of rules for the shared game that constitutes Bitcoin or Ethereum. In that shared game, we have a software implementation of what amounts to a central bank. So any central bank that you're going to see is basically a bunch of software and some government accreditation, right? The banks are made of software. So somebody takes a very simple model of a bank, puts it on top of one of these blockchain platforms. It's called Bitcoin. And it basically prints $4 million a day into existence and uses that money to pay the people that are running the platform. Now, the exact technical details of how it does that involve a whole bunch of very, very fiddly stuff about the speed of light and provable randomness and cryptography to ensure fairness and so on. But the basic operation is you have a software platform, everybody runs a little piece of the platform, the software platform implements a shared database, and the shared database has a set of rules which allow you to move money around, and it makes $4 million a day of funny money. And it just appears from nowhere, like a central bank of the internet. And you know, it doesn't actually sound that clever 10 years after we've had a chance to look at it. But let me tell you, 5 years ago, we looked at this thing like, this was left here by aliens. So, I'm not kidding, right? So on that platform, we then come along and say, well, what if we want to do something which is not a central bank, but has the same kind of reliability and robustness that this central bank of the internet has? Okay, I'm guessing that none of you are all that interested in basically using currencies to solve these problems. The objective is not to make some kind of coin, but the objective is to take the underlying, enormous strength of these databases and use it to solve a different big problem. Not how do we make payments, but how do we manage, I don't even want to use the word trust, but we'll call it trust for now. So this is our starting point. We're basically taking a chunk of this Promethean fire and we're using it to make something else. Now, this is super important in terms of really getting why this technology is here, but it's irrelevant to everything else I'm going to talk about, so if you don't follow this part, don't worry about it. The speed of light is why we have all of this technology around blockchains. So light is actually quite slow. You think of typically internet communication as being instantaneous, but if you do a call with somebody that's literally on the other side of the world, you'll keep clipping the beginning off their sentences and they'll keep talking over you. And that's happening because the round trip time on the internet backwards and forwards to, say, Australia is actually something like a 1/7 or a 1/10 of a second. It's long enough that the human being has systems that run much faster than that. And the speed of light is just a constant. You can't really change it. It's as fast as it goes. So we're always going to have this 1/10 of a second, up to maybe even a 1/4 second by the time you get into the networking layer, delay. And that delay is just fixed. We have to live with it. The further away two things are, the longer the message will take to propagate. Now, inside of your computers, you have a silicon chip that does all the work. The chip is maybe 1 centimeter across, and light has to go backwards and forwards across that maybe 50,000 times before it can complete a transaction. So if you imagine 50,000 centimeters, that gives you something like 5 kilometers, right? And in the length of time that it takes light to travel 5 kilometers, you can do one transaction. By the time you measure to the other side of the world and back, you've done thousands of transactions at home, or with your next door neighbor, or with the guy in the same city, in the length of time that it takes the single transaction to reach the destination and come all the way back with a confirmation. So you can't get around the fact that you're going to have a geography to computation. And then from that fact that computation has a geography comes some possible alternative shapes for the geography. So high frequency trading is we pick a single center, we put the big computer in the middle, and then the traders radiate out from that in concentric rings, depending on how much rent they can pay for the land that they're on. In New York, they sell space close to the exchanges by the cubic meter, and they're packing supercomputers into ever smaller boxes to carry out their trading algorithms and get the trades in faster. And this is a colossal waste of time and energy. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy way to run a world, but that's what they do. Similarly, Google faces this problem. Their approach is a thing called Spanner. I think that's the right name for it. Spanner? Spanner. Yeah. Right? So Spanner, they basically put an atomic clock in each one of their data centers. They time how long it takes to communicate between all the data centers, so they've got a really accurate map of the delay propagation between the data centers, and then they have a synthetic now. So because they've got this map of how long the time delays are, I say it happened now, the data center on the other side of the world receives a similar transaction almost exactly the same moment, including the correction for the time delay, and the one that happened first becomes the real one and the other one is thrown away. But to get that kind of synchronization function for the entire world, they need an atomic clock. They need to relativistically calculate and compute their networks. Right? This is crazy expensive, and it's not something that most institutions are ever going to do. It's also not likely to become planetary infrastructure, because how do you trust that the people calibrating your clocks have done it right and aren't playing with time for their advantage? It's hard to trust somebody else to manage your clock. So the final thing that you come to is blockchain. And the blockchain just comes along and says, right, we're going to get rid of the speed of light advantage by having a 10-minute block or even a 15-second block. So the block is long enough that speed of light delays don't make much difference. And then we're going to make it even more reliable and robust by randomly picking where on the world we're going to use as the center of the world for the next transaction batch. So you randomly pick a new point in the world on every batch. All the mining stuff is about making yourself eligible to be picked as a potential site to process the batch. You then process the batch any way you like in the order that those messages came to you usually, and then you put the thing out there and that's the next block, and that's your blockchain. But it's worth understanding that this is not a kind of trivial response to a bunch of lunatics who wanted to print their own money. It's a fundamental approach to a hard problem in computer science that in one direction gave us HFT, in another direction gave us Google Spanner, and in the third direction gives you blockchain. Anything that we do in future is going to have to overcome these constraints. So you're going to continue to see weird computing architectures that attempt to allow us to live in the illusion of a simultaneous now, even though the speed of light delay dominates everything to do with machines. So there is a deep thing there. If you want to understand this stuff, dig up a thing called the CAP theorem, and it really runs through why this is the way it is. So that's a little bit on blockchain. Now we're going to get into the trust stuff. So most of the stuff you're going to see in identity is just what I've referred to here as an irregular massive edge cases. It's just tons and tons and tons and tons of weird, difficult stuff that doesn't quite behave the way that you wanted it to behave. So you think you're going to use DNA for everything, you've got identical twins to deal with. You think you're going to use passports for everything, you discover that some failed states issued passports after the point where their government collapsed because the guy in the passport office still had a job. But there was no state to issue the documents. Or you wind up with all kinds of irregularities. And as a result, it's very difficult to just sit down and take a clean, simple approach to identity, because identity is much closer to biology than it is to engineering. Right? We're fundamentally looking for a whole bunch of stuff, which is about managing a living system called people. And if you think about how irregular and strange biology is, biology is filled with exceptions. Every rule that you could possibly have, biology will have an exception. Ants that fly, fish that walk, snakes that breathe underwater, you name it, there is an exact exception. And this is what identity is like. It's just always filled with exceptions. So there's no regularity that we could push on. There are really reliable averages, but unfortunately you can't build a system just to handle the averages. It's like having only one size of shoes. So take a new baby, right? Child number 1, born with massive identity in storage because the parents are known, they own houses, they've got jobs. You've got a solid record of that kid's ancestry for 3 generations in the tax database. No ambiguity, identity is completely straightforward and unproblematic. Baby number 2, 2 refugees, have a kid while they're traveling. They arrive, they're granted asylum, but they don't have any money, so they haven't got a fixed address. They're basically living with friends. And the country of origin they came from is now a failed state, and you've got no idea what their identity situation is over there, right? you can have a situation where both of those kids are fully legitimate UK citizens. One has rich identity, the other has practically no identity, just a birth certificate, and the rest of the national system has to treat them exactly in the same way from that point onwards because they're both UK citizens. And this is by no means the weirdest kind of problem that you get in an identity thing. That's a typical problem in identity. How can you make a system which will equally well represent both of these individuals when one of them has a completely solid frame of reference and the other has nothing at all? This is the identity problem, right? It's not about the average case and figuring out how to make the average case work. If you build a system that kind of sort of works for the average case, it will be completely harassed by the things that nobody ever thought of when they built it, and then it will become an enormous maze of exceptions. This is part of why banking is the way that banking is. Banking is a sea of exception handling. Every time something goes wrong, every time something gets complicated, another department, couple of people in the department, another set of rules for those couple of people to manage. It's a constant accumulation of edge cases. Same thing, why is the US tax code 100,000 pages long? Edge cases. The real world is super complicated, and when you put money on the table, people get really, really clever. And whatever identity architecture comes out of this is going to have to deal with that. Biometrics, right? Everybody loves biometrics in theory. In practice, I have never yet met an organization that was happy with its biometric rollout. The stuff doesn't work. Not cleanly, not reliably, not for all people. You know, somebody comes in and they've mashed their hand, in a corridor over the weekend, they can't get into their computer. Now what do we do? I don't know what my passport is, I always use my thumb. Well, your thumb's in a bandage, what do we do, right? Lots of companies will make claims for their biometric systems which are largely exaggerated. They'll tell you they have a 100% accurate eyeball scanner or whatever it is. Some percentage of the population don't have eyes, right? Problem. If you're using it for everything, this will be an issue. Eyes change over time. The companies will tell you it's 100% reliable, but 30 years later, how much has the eyeball changed? And they're not likely to be willing to pick up the pieces when you begin to get these kinds of problems, because the companies that are selling the technology are not large enough to bear the weight of fixing the problems if the problems are large. So biometrics are unlikely to provide a kind of one-click answer to the biometric problem, to the identity problem, even before we start looking at the terrible problems with privacy and trust and people cloning biometrics. If we went to a largely biometric solution, I bet there would be a roaring trade in rubber fingers. You put your glass back on a bar, somebody lifts the fingerprints, takes a picture of your face from the security camera, sells it as a package on the internet. I've got a fake finger for this person. And you could have tons of identity fraud even in a system that had really good biometrics, because you only have to fool the sensor on the end of the process, and the sensor on the end of the process costs 50 cents. Right? It's not going to provide you with the kind of bulletproof protection that people want, because it's very hard to keep control of the biometrics. And if I know what it's supposed to look like, I can almost certainly fool a cheap sensor. So there is no solid joy down this path. Not in that instance. So the other problem that we have with identity, and this is really the worst problem in the entire space, is that identity is a magnet word for bad thinking. Right? The only worse magnet word for bad thinking that you're going to get is religion. Right? Everybody has a feeling inside of them that they are a unique entity that in some way is special. Right? And the thing about this specialness is it's ineffable. You can't put it into words. You can't communicate this special magic essence inside of us to people. Maybe there are a few great artists or dancers or novelists that in some way manage to communicate this special thing about them in a concrete way that other people recognize. But for the most part of what makes a human being is that this deep internal sense that I am something distinct from other people is almost impossible for us to express in a way that others can recognize. So we hear the word identity and we think, well, I am this special snowflake, I'm unique, I have this thing which is me-ness. But what we don't understand is that we have no way of expressing that to other people in a way that they can instantly and immediately recognize. Right? So everybody thinks identity is that special me thing, we just need to find a way of naming that. But in practice, it's almost impossible to get a reliable expression of this identity concept in a way that allows other people to recognize it, never mind machines. And this mismatch between how we feel our own identity and the problem of dealing with identity as a bulk property of enormous numbers of people means that our intuition about identity is almost always completely backwards, right? The constant grasping for the sense of a solid, platonic, real self that we can then somehow tag with a machine just leads us up a whole sea of dead ends. And everybody that comes to this field goes through a phase where you just go like, oh, it doesn't work. And then we have to pick up and move on from there. I can see some of the people that have been around this for a while nodding like, yeah, we got there too. Don't worry, there is a solution. Right? So, what I want to talk about now is I want to nail this thing called reductive trust. Right? Reductive trust is where you make the problem simple enough that you can find a trust solution that will work for it. Good example, cryptography on mobile phones. You simplify the problem down until you can put it on a little chip, you put the chip on the phone is now authorized to take money out of your bank account. Reductive trust is really great if you can find a problem that is suitable for reductive trust. You can engineer systems and they work cleanly and it's all great. Humans cannot be handled with reductive trust. It doesn't matter how much you try and simplify and standardize. You're going to tag all the kids when they're born. You're going to carry them through the system with a constant handoff of identity documents. You can build all of that. The infinite variability in human life and the really surprising variability in human biology make it almost impossible to build reductive trust systems that work with humans. Even the military can't really make reductive trust work for its own staff, right? You know the saying about military spec in America, right? You give two young Marines in a padded cell 2 bowling balls, and when you come back, one bowling ball is missing and the other one is broken, and neither Marine knows anything, right? Even in completely artificial environments where we have massive control over circumstance, we can't get reductive trust to work, right? Even in the military, how much equipment goes missing or is broken unaccountably or just gets lost, right? How often do you find that personnel have a different background from the one you thought? How often do records get lost? Even in the most controlled environment, chaos is still king. Entropy rules everything. Right? So, lesson number 1, right? We cannot simply stamp a number on the engine block of every human being, right? There's no way of applying reductive trust to human beings. We cannot simplify the problem in any meaningful way and expect it to behave itself. So, anything that smacks of we just reduce the problem to putting a big old number on every single human being, we're going to enumerate the set, forget it. It's just not the way it will work. In practice, 1%, 2% of the population will turn out to be completely immune to whatever reductive trust model was applied because they don't have the right kind of history or they don't have the right kind of biology and the system will fall to pieces. It's just not viable. So I want to suggest looking at a different question, which is not the insoluble identity problem, but the consequences of identity. Right? We have this kind of utopian vision of how we want the world to work if the identity system is perfect. Somebody comes and says, hey, you want to buy my house? You smile, you shake hands, you have a little conversation, you wave each other's mobile phones at each other, all of the document stuff gets verified, maybe you shoot a little video of yourself agreeing to the deal, and then the deal is done. Boom, everything's perfect. This is the sort of world that we want if the identity system works. A working identity system should just let us get things done. Right? Now, that might be a world that we could create without having to get this kind of reductive trust model going. Right? Other things that are kind of hard to do that you'd like to be able to sort out. How do I make sure that if I'm in an auction, none of the other people in the auction are actually the same person? Right? If I'm the one selling the object, it would be very advantageous to be able to bid against myself sometimes in the auction. If we're playing poker and 2 of the people at the table are actually the same person, they've got all kinds of tricks that they can play where one player will sacrifice short-term interest for the greater interest of the other player. So quite often we want to prove negatives, and proving negatives is really hard. Right? Almost all of the identity stuff that we've discussed today is about proving positives. Is X, Y? Is the person who bought this house now the person that sold the house then? But trying to prove that people are different is an equally important problem. It's less common, but it's incredibly key to the functioning of the economy in a lot of places. You don't want the business person to also be their own auditor. So we need identity which allows us to separate as well as to prove continuity. You have to be able to make distinctions. So what I'm going to suggest is that we want a system that lets us make good decisions often enough that the weight of the good decisions outweighs the weight of the bad decisions. That what we're really looking for is a systemic function. The system as a whole functions, the system as a whole is profitable. We are always in a position where we've got enough good stuff going on that it covers whatever little problems we have when things don't work. And I'm going to suggest that the rational way of approaching this is that we need to design insurance models which allow us to take this kind of trust problem and manage it in an efficient, integrated, sensible way. Now, insurers are already people that know a ton about you. They know what you're worth, they know anything special that you own, they know where you live, and they've often got these data sets for years and years and years. Most people probably haven't thought about their insurer in years, right? They send you a bill, you pay the bill, it goes on. There could be somebody in this room with a 15 or 20-year relationship with their insurer, and you've almost certainly thought about it less than you think about your bank. So the insurers are probably in a position where a lot of people already trust them. They're in a position where they're relatively good at keeping secrets. They're in a position where they don't really talk very much to other institutions, which is quite nice because it means they don't have a bunch of unfair advantage to draw from insider knowledge. They've got a bunch of really good attributes for doing the kind of stuff that we want them to do. Also, insurance is something which is relatively limitless. So right now, Visa is probably the biggest global sort of access point to the financial system that we have. And Visa is choked off by its inability to manage the identity problem. They can't get outside of really, basically the rich areas of the world because you just can't issue a Visa card to a homeless person in Bangladesh. You don't have a foundation of trust that allows you to extend credit to them. And as a result, Visa is deadlocked in its ability to do finance. So ideally, what we would like is a system that has global reach. Use the insurance paradigm to build something which allows you to get into every single corner of the world in principle. The technology and the finance and the regulation might stop you getting there today, but you want to be able to get there in the long run, right? And I think this is particularly relevant for a Dutch audience because at the end of the day, you're a trading nation, right? You understand that a lot of the stuff that came in the past that made your ancestors wealthy came from places where they barely understood the culture, they just showed up and did business. And that ability to just show up and do business is incredibly useful, and you could be custodians of a system that allows you to do that, right? There is no reason that a small country can't have global reach. This is one of the great advantages of the internet. So, conclusions. First set. Biometrics and state documents are both unreliable, right? People are constantly trying to get driving licenses when they shouldn't have one. They're trying to forge passports. They're making fake identities for identity theft. They're doing all of this stuff, and it's common, right? Biometrics, similar problems, and this is before we've seen any really organized criminal attempt to subvert the biometric systems. So at this point, give up all hope of getting hard identity out of the human system. Not happening, not going to come. If we're going to have to deal with probabilities, right, where every identity is a probabilistic function, I don't tell you that John is, this particular John and has that tax number. I tell you this guy is 95.9% likely to be that guy. You see, that's not good enough. I need better information. I need 99.5 before we can do the deal. All of the identity transactions that occur in the real world are probabilistic transactions, right? And that's the case for the real data, right? The actual defect rate for almost anything is about 1% if human beings are involved. I'm sure there are organizations which are, for example, like banks trying to track down money that they've given people. I bet they know exactly what their misidentification rate is, and I bet it's not zero. So, active oppositional fraud, constant exposure to other people's risk. So you're constantly getting countries that have less solid identity data coming and doing business with you. Not a problem to be solved, but a risk to be managed. So this is the kind of paradigm shift that I'm asking people to make, right? Can we generally agree that this sounds sensible? Are there any questions or objections at this part? Because if this part is wrong, the rest is basically a waste of time, right? Does this sound about right? Yes.
So is there also a probabilistic law about that in legal compliance?
Well, I think it has to be probabilistic, right? And in fact, I'm going to come to compliance at the end of this because this is a super hard problem, right? the law would like it to be that you, as the business, know exactly who you're dealing with, but in actual fact, the law knows that there is an error rate, and somehow there has to be a negotiation about taking that error rate from something that's pushed under the rug to saying, this is our identity compliance rate, is it high enough or not? Right? Which is exactly what they do for, say, aviation, right? It has to be 6 nines perfect, 5 nines perfect, 4 nines perfect, and you figure out what the compliance rate is, and then you express that probabilistically. I can't see another way of doing this. Okay, so now some fun. Blockchain guy will beat on the blockchain. Cryptographic fallacy, right? It's just a computer. If you tell it something which is wrong, it will store the wrong thing that you've told it perfectly. The cryptography doesn't correct errors, right? It preserves them, it pickles them, it makes them really, really, really clear, it stores them for you. It doesn't correct the errors. So what cryptography offers identity is lowering a transaction cost. This it can do very reliably. You got it right the first time, you store the fact that you got it right the first time in there. You can transmit that and extend that fact to other people very easily. What it does not do is help you get it right the first time. The reason that blockchains have this amazing reputation for reliability is because they don't touch the real world. And if you have any computer system that never touches the real world, it's incredibly reliable, right? It just lives in its own universe. The coins are generated on the blockchain, they're spent on the blockchain, they're used on the blockchain, all the assets are on the blockchain. This is where the reliability comes from. So, I basically have covered this. HTTPS certificates. This is supposed to be the gold standard secure backbone for processing all your credit cards online. Agencies called certificate authorities are supposed to provide the identity layer for this. You give them $1,500 and you ask for a certificate. They check your paperwork and make sure that you're working for the organization you're supposed to be working for. They hand you a certificate. This goes wrong really often, right? There was a cracking one of these where a Microsoft security update certificate was misissued, and somebody went around basically issuing viruses that your computer was programmed to treat as Microsoft. So if even the certificate authority infrastructure is vulnerable to fraud, how are you going to have an identity system that's equally protected? It's just not going to happen. So, right, nothing is worse than bad information with digital signatures on it. Because people look at the digital signature, they usually don't even verify it. Oh, it's got a digital signature, it must be true. If they do verify, oh, it was said by the person who said it, that means it must be true, right? They really want to believe that the magic block of crap on the bottom of the message equals the message is the truth, right? And that's a sociological problem. People are still mystified by this wizard crypto stuff, and they constantly want to overextend the trust onto those systems. We don't want to do that, right? The cryptography is for reducing the transaction costs. It's not for securing the systems, right? These things have to be separated. So, given that we've got this predictable risk, 0.5%, 1%, 2%, 4%, given that we've got systems that are in constant attack from fraud, let's figure out how to get the insurers to take up the slack. Visa only works because Visa insures every credit card transaction. You would not use Visa at all if every time somebody ripped you off, you lost the money that they'd taken. Visa is big enough and heavy enough that it generates enough extra transaction volume that it can just pay for the losses on the way. They're taking their, whatever it is, 1% cut of 1% of global transactions or something like that, and they're just using that to smooth out any little problems that occur. Oh, look, we lost a lot of money over there, just pad that out. And as a result, we use the Visa system as if it was completely reliable and bomb-proof. Our user experience of Visa is that Visa is perfect. Visa's experience of Visa is that they're running around like mad people just whacking problems with a mallet. But we never see that because our risks are insured, and so the system appears to be perfect to the people who matter, who are its customers. And this is what we could do for identity. We could get a system that's 99.5% right, we could cover the remaining cracks with insurance, and then we could have a system which basically feels perfect because it's got a properly designed way of handling the gap between what the computer says and what the world actually did.
Credit card, non-present fraud is in the billions.
Yes.
That's what we talk about.
Yeah.
The issuer of cards
Yes.
can offload it to the schemes, and
Yeah.
in the end the merchants pay.
Yes.
And so that's how it works.
Exactly. Right. And if we didn't have that system, credit cards just wouldn't be a thing.
Absolutely.
right? So we could have a much more reliable credit card infrastructure. We could cut the fraud by 90%. And you could argue that the insurers are preventing us from doing that by making us too comfortable. Pathological.
Flaw in the system, among the ECB, but also the Fed in your published documents about it.
Yes, absolutely. And there's no denying the credit card infrastructure should be tighter. But if it's a choice between a somewhat loose credit card system that covers up cracks that maybe it should be fixing.
By the way, the same for MasterCard.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. But it just shows that these systems can be viable global infrastructure even with a bunch of cracks. And we're not going to get perfect systems, so we've just got to figure out how to get the insurance guys involved, or we can't do it. Okay, so this is another important pattern, right? If the systems are really close to perfect, they need more insurance, not less insurance. So aviation is dominated by very nearly perfect engineering and absolutely gigantic insurance settlements. Taxis, when they go wrong, they just turn the wrong way on the road and you wind up having to go 20 miles outside of your way and you charge a little more money and there's no insurance for that because it happens all the time. So when you get closer and closer and closer to perfect systems, the need for insurance rises rather than falls because nobody ever plans for them to go wrong. The identity system is going to be an insurance system. So the pattern here, the kind of deep conceptual template, is a composite, like carbon fiber. Carbon fiber, you have this long kind of stringy stuff, which is the actual carbon, and then you put it into epoxy resin, and it becomes incredibly strong because you've got two systems that do slightly different things. Different kinds of strength are combined. The cryptography gets you the hard transit, right? You take something, you lock it down with cryptography, it stays locked, you're good. But at the edge of the cryptography, you get this kind of squishy, hard to navigate real world thing. Into that, you deploy insurance. The system is a composite of cryptography and insurance. And I think that that composite of cryptography and insurance is going to be the dominant paradigm for most of the 21st century's financial innovation. I really believe that cryptography and insurance are perfect counterbalances for each other because cryptography is mathematically perfect and precise, and therefore the problem will never be in the cryptography. The problem will always be where the cryptography connects to other systems. It's always going to be weaker at the join than it is inside of the cryptographic structure. So we go through the world deploying cryptography to solve whole new classes of problems. Every single one of those will be weak at the joint with the real world, and every single one of those is going to get covered by insurance. This is the design pattern for the 21st century. So, the data is soft. I think we've already covered that pretty well. Blockchain gives us hard data sharing. Yeah, we covered that. So, let's actually take a crack at designing a little bit of a system that might actually do the job. And this is a little vague. I didn't intend this to be a business plan, but I think you'll see how nicely it fits on top of the stuff that the Evernym guys were talking about. Right? It's actually quite a close fit. We use a lot of the same terminology. We hadn't actually looked at each other's stuff in about a year and a half. So it's funny how much convergence there has been. So we start with a decision-centric model. So as an organization, I publish the fact that there is a specific decision that I make. So I'm an organization that will decide whether or not it will grant a mortgage, and I publish that fact. I'm a mortgage-making organization, and here's a list of the criteria that I use for deciding whether to give somebody a mortgage. The idea that you could have published lists of the things that you want, right? What are the things that need to be in the profile before I can make a decision? That seems very reasonable. We've got informal ways of doing that now that could be formalized very easily. A decision maker is a person that publishes a profile request. Give me this information, I will make a decision for you. A claim is an insured fact. Now this is where we begin to hit new territory. So I go to my state's driving license issuing body and say, I would like you to give me a certificate, a digital certificate that proves that I have a car license. They say, sure, here's that information. But if I then use that information for an insurer, and that information let's say a car insurance, and that information turns out to be wrong because I gave them a fake passport and they give me a fake ID, the insurer is now left carrying the bag, the car insurance person. So that car insurer might want insurance on the certificate that's come from the Department of Motor Vehicle Licensing. So I take my certificate from the motor vehicle guys, I go and say, hey, I would like you to give me some professional indemnity insurance on this statement of fact from the motor vehicle guys. They look at the motor vehicle thing, they say that's okay, they want a second look at my passport, they want to look at some GPS information from my car, and at the end of that they make a decision that for the grand fee of 75 pence, they will give me £20,000 worth of additional insurance on that fact. Right? I then take that to my car insurer. So the idea is that we're basically building a business model where people take statements of fact from institutions, couple them with an insurance product, and then use them as ways of generating certainty. And this is exactly the same model as Visa. Visa takes a payment instrument and wraps insurance on it. We take an identity instrument, we wrap insurance on it. The insurance is what makes Visa usable. The suggestion that I'm making is insurance is what makes digital identity usable. So a claim vendor is somebody that knows something about me and is willing to issue insurance on that fact. An attribute, right? The fact, the insurance, we bring the two things together, we take a set of those claims and we assemble them into a profile. So the profile is lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different insured claims that other people are making about my life. Here's a claim from my university, here's a claim from my power company, here's a claim from my government. I take all of these things, some of them came with insurance, some of them I have to buy insurance for, and then when I go to do something like get a mortgage, I slam this entire thing on the desk and say, all of these people are willing to put their money behind my claim that I am who I say I am. And if something goes wrong, you can claim against this enormous pile of insurance and all of your losses will be made whole. And at that point, it should be fairly easy to do the deal because the person on the other side of the desk experiences no identity risk. We've covered the identity risk with the insurance package. Very simple models. You could have small-time claim insurance people. You take a passport to an office, they verify the passport, they look at it, they call the passport office, they do some basic fraud checking, they make sure the picture isn't stuck on with glue, they write you a certificate. I then hand that to somebody, they don't have to see my passport, they just have to know that somebody who's an expert has seen the passport and has written claim insurance on it. Right? Suddenly we begin to see how insurance can substitute for information. So if I show you the insurance, you don't have to see the data that was used to generate the insurance. So the possibility is that we reclaim privacy because we have very strong relationships with our insurers and they know an awful lot about us. But that information is not given to the people we want to do business with, only the proof of insurance is given. So there's an opportunity here to build a business model which has the ability to generate privacy again in a way that's advantageous for everybody in the loop. I, as a bank, don't really want to know all that much about you as long as I know that your loan will be paid. I, as an insurer, want to know everything about you, but I don't want anybody else to know that stuff because it reduces the need for my insurance. The insurers actually have a very strong vested interest in making sure that their customers' privacy is respected. So, other people that can make claims. Universities know an awful lot about their students, particularly their academic performance. Passports we've discussed. Proof of address verification. There must be 50 entities that have a strong proof of your address. Any one of them could give you a little bit of insurance. Yes, we know that address is valid. Lots of the claims that you want are things that somebody in your environment has really good, solid information on. Your landlord, your mortgage holder, your employer. All of these people have repositories of data. You don't want that data just being handed to third parties, but an insurance object based on that data is something that would be very useful to be able to present to people when you wanted to validate an identity. Yeah?
So, yeah, just it's a fascinating idea.
Thank you.
And we've tried to solve this problem for 30 years, and we haven't. And now you're introducing another middleman, which is an insurer. And we give Nobel Prizes to people who try to understand this, and you're doing incentive alignment. That insurers has the right incentives to behave nicely.
Precisely.
But then you mentioned business model, so by introducing another middleman and this insurance entity, you solve a lot of problems.
Yes.
But for real world use cases and the killer app and for uptake, which tried and failed for 30 years, you're adding friction, another person. So how can you compete with the existing world by adding magic and another middleman?
So this is the magic which allows you to use the blockchain for managing identity. If you want to manage identity on a blockchain because you want the ultra-low transaction costs and the high security, my assertion is you're not going to be able to do that successfully without bringing insurers along with you. Right? I think the price of using cryptography to solve the problems is that you require insurers to smooth out the edges.
Yes. They may not necessarily be other parties, right? If you have an attribute provider and the signature that he puts on his attribute is taken to mean I will cover anything that goes wrong because of your own claim for, say, $200, only means that this party has another function, namely he will actually have to be liable to some extent for what he's telling.
Yes.
That's another way of putting the same thing.
Exactly, right? So all the kind of cryptography that people are talking about with attributes and third parties and zero knowledge proofs and all the rest of that stuff, it's a very small addition to add some cash into those. Right? I don't think that this requires much rethinking of the technology, but I think it provides that all-important smoothing out, which will let the technology work in the real world. Because this is the problem that we all have. Everybody wants the technology to just work, but the technology doesn't just work because of all these funny-looking edge cases. We need some way of smoothing it.
Does reputation management in some way or form help out? I mean, if three parties basically attribute that I'm Andrew, and would my insurance fee be lower, or?
No.
Are we
Okay.
talking?
How are we doing for time? Okay.
No,
So there's reputation to me is just. I hate reputation systems.
Reputation is
I just hate them. So the reason I hate reputation systems is that I think that they affect human society in much the same way as inappropriate surveillance by the state, right? Being constantly watched by your neighbors, by the people that you're doing business with, and having all that stuff published with star ratings. Uber drivers are not very happy because their business is constantly being monitored, and crazy people get into your cab and then ruin your reputation just because they're crazy. And by the time the system has smoothed out the bumps in the reputation over some statistical average, your career is ruined. So,
looking more for kind of an objective.
Yeah,
approach. I mean, if
yeah.
you treat people,
Right.
saying,
So if we assume for a moment that peer-based reputation systems are just inherently difficult, i.e. evil, and really dislike them, right? The other prospect is that you could have actual performance, right? So you've turned up to work every day for years and your boss thinks you're great. That should definitely lower your insurance stuff if you're doing something HR-related function, right? There ought to be lots and lots of places where good conduct is rewarded, but it ought to be in the form of people that are willing to put money behind your claim that you're an okay person. Because the thing about reputation is there's no consequence to reputation, good or bad, so it tends to be awarded on things other than performance. Whereas when you put money on the line and say, okay, so how much do you really trust your brother-in-law? Right? And at that point, we get to get a much more accurate read of what the real trust structure is. So there's another version of this talk that I have not yet given, which basically tries to break down the idea of trust into actually trust is just a proxy for accountability. And this is an accountability, you see, right? So this is an accountability system. It's not a trust system, it's an accountability system. When something goes wrong, I will be sorted out, right? I took the risk, it went wrong, you will make me whole, that's the relationship we have. In many ways, it's a non-trust system. The person making the trust is the insurer, and the insurer's job is to not make mistakes. And there's good constant market pressure on those guys to be accurate. Anyway, let's crack on. So, yeah.
There are at least 5 parties, 5 identities in any card payment involved in the credit card payment. The citizen, the consumer, the issuing bank, card scheme, could be Visa, MasterCard, or whatever. The merchant, or the merchant acquirer, and the acquiring bank.
Yes.
And the key problem today is the identity of the merchant.
Yes.
That is the core of the problem.
Absolutely.
And at least 20% of the data, of the merchant data, are incorrect according to a famous global consulting firm. So how do you see that through an insurance model you can upgrade the system, the flaws in the system, to have less card not present fraud? Because that's the real problem. And from a consumer perspective, the consumer is covered anyhow.
Yes.
However, the consumer may not get what he wants because know your supplier is also a complex problem on the
Yes.
internet.
Visa is a really hard case because they've already got an insurable thing here. What they have is a very badly behaved insurable thing. So because the entity that's charging the transaction fees is also acting as the insurer, there is no competitive pressure in a market of insurers to force the credit card fraud rate down.
As long as the merchant pays, there is no issue.
Precisely, right? So what we've created is a situation in which we've taken the market pressure out of the insurance game, and at that point the incentives are misaligned.
And there's the game of swapping the liability, which they did some years ago.
Yeah.
Uh,
But all of this stuff is
if you
created.
don't use a chip instead of MaxDrive, then you have to pay as a merchant even more.
Yes. But that mechanism has basically taken all of the incentives out of the insurable risk structure, right? Because it's a monopoly, because they can charge what they like, they can move the weight of the fraud fees around. The pressure towards actual technical excellence to lock those systems has been removed. And as a result, the whole thing is very slack. It's quite problematic.
Will the insurance companies who will take over the risk of card schemes?
I am not sure that Visa will let anybody get into that game, right? So it may be that structure is beyond help. Because if a reinsurer, but if Visa is making so much money that it can just insure its own risk on this stuff, then the competitive market for insurance will not provide any benefit because we have a monopoly in insurer that's acting in a pathological way.
Should we introduce prediction markets into this element? Because obviously you have competition in the prediction market.
Yes.
In effect, it's an insurance market.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, very, very fast. Yeah. No, absolutely. How am I doing for time, by the way? Because we started kind of late, but according to my watch, I should be almost finished.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, right. Okay, so we're going to go very quickly through the remaining bit. So let's take care of this. Specialized claim insurers cover hard cases. So in the same way that if you want to insure art, you can grab something from a specialized insurer that understands the value of your art and manages it appropriately. Specialized insurers that cover specific kinds of identity risk, a few are listed. Claims are ideal for blockchain use, right? A claim is basically a contract. It's very unambiguous. It doesn't have much squishy stuff on it. It's a great thing to put on a blockchain where the ultra-low transaction cost environment is a good fit for the actual object. The facts can be ambiguous, but the identity of the insurer and the amount of insurance being offered in the policy documents, all that stuff is cut and dried. So there's a really good possibility for having a regulated industry, which are these information insurers, and all that stuff is a good fit for the blockchain. We keep the actual facts off the blockchain as much as possible. Profiles, partly on a blockchain, all kinds of clever stuff about zero-knowledge proof, ZK, snarks, all of this kind of stuff that the identity companies are working with. All of that stuff is a great idea. Exactly what model will win out probably depends on advanced mathematics, and there's so much work being done in those areas like homomorphic encryption. Today's model will not be the same model we'd use in 10 years. It's likely to keep improving. Stacking claims is how it works in the real world. You take every little place where somebody's got a set of information about you, you ask them to turn that into an offer for a claim, you then buy as many of those claims as you need to get the job done on whatever thing it is you want to do that requires this kind of hard identity. What we're talking about is being able to monetize knowing stuff about people in a way that the people themselves control. I, as the customer, pay you for information about me in the form of an insurance product. That keeps the individual in control of the system as a whole because the individual is the payer. If we move this around so the individual is no longer the payer, you'll get the same kind of structural corruption that you see in the Visa example. Right? You need to make sure the individual has skin in the game. Consequences and consequential loss, it's just about managing consequential loss, keeping everything wrapped up into these consequential loss units. Right? There's really no other reason that we want all this information or all this identity stuff other than managing consequential loss. Accurate pricing of risk is a really good idea. For this, you need competitive markets. If you wind up with pathological monopolies, the risk is no longer going to be accurately priced. So it's very important that there is market design in this kind of a thing, and this is an ideal role for regulators. Regulators need to be really on top of this thing, because if you get monopolies, you will not get a performant identity architecture. Setting price on the wrong facts. So basically, right, it all comes down to how much cover do you need. You're buying an insurance product. The more ambiguity there is, the more expensive it will be. The more cover you need, the more expensive it will be. This is a great place for people to put all their clever proprietary trading algorithms. There are huge opportunities here for smart people to get really good at figuring out what the truth is. And I think we all could agree that prediction markets would be a mechanism you could use there, not the only one. But having a set of industries whose job it is to get really good at figuring out the truth, incredibly useful. The identity ownership thing, the individual facts are owned by other entities, right? The assemblage of those facts and the rendering of that information to something that can be used is owned by me. And this bridges nicely this problem of half of the stuff is owned by one person, half of it is owned by another. You know my driving record, I'm the person that was doing the driving. We package that up into an insurance product, I pay for it, we sell it. Very, very, very simple. Okay, the hard question about regulators, right? To get this thing to work, regulators would need to be comfortable with companies having a probabilistic relationship with their insured risk, right? We are 97.5% sure that we have everybody's identity correct. The edge cases will amount to no more than 1% of our portfolio by weight. Those kind of approaches, this is why you need a small country to implement this kind of thing. Because right now, almost all the financial system regulations simply state you're going to know who your customers are, end of story, and then you have to eat the costs of the risks internally. Small country advantage, you can have sophisticated relationships with regulators, you can show them the internal fraud data, and they can use that to manage the risk expectations. So, facts are useless, give me insurance. This is basically the story in a nutshell. That's what we want to preserve. 3 final rules, right? Actually 4. Human systems are imperfect. Right? Don't forget that whenever you hear somebody talking the techno-nonsense about how cryptography will save the world, humans are imperfect. As a result, human systems are imperfect. Not everything can have equal focus. Right? Some parts of your system will be very tightly controlled and very reliable, like avionics. Some parts will be incredibly unreliable, like luggage. Right? And whenever somebody says the blockchain will make everything equally transparent, no, it won't. Right? It's not how the world is. Facts in blockchains will be a mess because the facts will be mishandled because everybody will see that this fact was on a blockchain and they will assume it to be true. When you get bad information into a blockchain, it will be much more dangerous than bad information scrawled on the back of an envelope. So be aware that people will psychologically overinflate the value of facts on a blockchain. We can't stop that happening. Finally, right, specialized knowledge, right? If we figure out a way of taking all the slack in these systems, all the imprecision, and selling it to people whose job it is to pick through it and fix it, you'll get a whole bunch of new technology from people that are very, very good at figuring out what is true, and this is socially good. So what we're talking about is basically figuring out how to build new industries who are in the job of doing information assurance, and to create those new industries, we have a market design, and that market design is really the challenge. If we can create a market which will allow these companies to exist, they'll come into existence and they'll solve our problems. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much. This is
Cool. Thank you.
a little wine, still a bit cold, but I think you gave enough input. I'm not sure if you agree, but to the Muppet table at least.
Definitely.
Definitely. But I also think it's a new paradigm of thinking. I like it very much. Me personally, I don't know what you thought, but okay, shall we leave? You'll be here for the next 2 days?
Yes, yeah, I'm here for the rest of the show.
We'll need you, I think.